Well, everyone, we are in for an incredible treat today. I'd like to invite you right now, if you've just been in the process of kind of getting yourself together and getting into your space, to maybe begin to settle a little bit and land as we are getting ready to enter into the space with the magnificent and extraordinary Ray Johnson. The title of Ray's talk for today, which I am absolutely in love with, is 1,000 Paper Cuts, Embodied Microaggressions in Clinical Practice and in Everyday Life. And if you were there in the community integration session that I led prior to this, one of the things that I said was 1,000 paper cuts reminds me of the experience of life. I don't know that there's any single person in here who can't say that they haven't had that embodied experience. And so we are so much looking forward to getting some context around how it is that we navigate those experiences and integrate it within our being. The magnificent Dr. Ray Johnson is a somatic scholar and activist whose work focuses on the intersection of embodiment and social justice. They are the author of Embodied Social Justice. Peep that book, and teach internationally on embodied activism, nonverbal expressions of implicit bias, and the poetic body. So please welcome within your hearts and your souls and your beings the very dear Dr. Ray Johnson for a very special session.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm not entirely sure I can live up to that. It's just all warm and fluttery.
I'm just amping you up.
I've never heard myself being described as marvelous so often in such a short period of time. Thank you so much. I feel the warmth and affection, and really do appreciate it. So one of the things that I should probably say, as we're going to be with one another for the next hour and a half, is that you will, and I'm going to do it now actually, you will likely see me wiping my eyes. And it's because I've got some difficulty with the drainage ducts in my eyes. And also, sometimes every once in a while, when someone like Sarah says something particularly lovely to me, I am one of those people who tears up a lot through sort of my emotional embodied responses to things. But I will also be dabbing at my eyes all the way through. And so just know that I'm fine. it's just me taking care of my eyes as we go through this. So I think I want to start by saying thank you. By really appreciating and extending my gratitude to Scott Lyons and Corinne Bell, who you will have encountered already in your engagement with this summit, really appreciating their leadership in bringing this all to us. And also all of the dear colleagues that are in this work, Sarah, absolutely, and Reverend Angel and other folks that I've worked with. This increasingly is feeling like a community to me. And even before an event like this, where it's clear that there is some real international interest and capacity and engagement in these issues already, even before that, I've really benefited from colleagues and collaborators and co-instigators along the way. And I just want to take a moment and say thank you. This is not work that I think can be done well alone, and it's certainly not work that I have ever felt that I have done alone. So I also want to say a particular thank you. I hope she's on the call today, to Dr. Christine Caldwell, who you will hear present in a couple of days. Christine and I go way back, and I always think of her in deep gratitude, particularly when I'm presenting on this material, because she was the first person that I ever said, I think I want to research the embodied experience of oppression. And her response, and her yeah, let's do that, was so heartening and so encouraging. that I just want to name Christine in particular. Thank you so much for being a friend and a colleague who has been supportive of my work in this area for so many years. So I'd also like to dedicate today's session specifically to anyone who has ever scanned their environment for potential relational threat. Anyone who has ever felt unskilled or ashamed of their response to that relational threat. And to everyone who has been willing to listen and acknowledge when the harm that they unconsciously enacted was brought to their attention. Okay, so hopefully you can feel in that dedication that I'm really probably talking about everyone. And I wanted to speak to that specifically so that we could all be in this together in a way that hopefully is with a little less judgment and perhaps a little less shame, recognizing that this is something, this dance that we do around embodied microaggressions, I think is, as Sarah suggested at the beginning of this session, it's part of the fabric of our lives. And although we've inherited social systems that make this little paper cutty, ouchy, one up, one down, diggy thing that we do with one another, something that's absolutely part of our everyday lives, I actually think that it's possible to shift those dynamics. And so I'm hoping that what I'm offering today will help us engage with these issues and maybe become a little more skilled and feel a little less de-skilled or ashamed or awkward or embarrassed or called in or called out. Yeah, okay. I want to start with just taking a moment, just because this territory can be tender and maybe a little bit activating for some, depending on what I say, not knowing who you all are in the room and where your tender points are. So maybe just let's all together take a moment and just, oh, yeah. And maybe you have a look around the room, particularly if you've been on Zoom all day, and just reconnect, reorient with your environment in a way that feels helpful. Just like, oh yeah, here I am. And maybe just taking a nice, easy, comfortable breath or two. Just like, yeah. Maybe feeling your body on the chair underneath you, or your feet on the ground. You might want to do, if it helps, just a stretch and a yawn or a shift. Just whatever helps you feel more settled in, perhaps a little more grounded, a little more present, a little more available to yourself. And I'd like to invite you to come back to this place of, oh yeah, it's me, I'm okay, here I am. That place of perhaps centered and grounded and feeling a little bit resourced. Anytime you need to, throughout the next 90 minutes that we're together, just to remind you to come back to that place. You can stop and take a break. You can turn the volume down or mute me or step away from your computer. Just if you need to just take a little bit of space from a topic that can be challenging sometimes. And I recognize that. So I just really encourage you to take care of yourselves as we go through this. If you're watching this later, the same applies. Just pause and come back to it when you're ready, when you're feeling available to the material, right? Because this should not be a forced march, right? This should be something that we're actually engaging with because we feel able and ready. Yeah, okay, great. The other thing that I'd just like to add to that in terms of coming to this work in a way where you really give yourself permission to come to it in a way that feels resourced, is that I'm going to walk us through some material, and at certain points in the session today, I'm going to invite you to sort of try on some things. Not full-blown experiential exercises, but just a little invitation here and there to try some things or to imagine some things. And one of the things that we know about the imagination is that our body responds to what we imagine as much as it does to what's really happening. So even in those invitations to imagine or to remember something, I might say, you know, can you think of a time when you experienced a microaggression like this, for example? Just know that your body may respond to that invitation, and that response might just mean that you need to take a little bit of time, maybe just take a little bit of the invitation, not the whole invitation. You don't necessarily jump in, but dip your toe in the water first and take the temperature and go, oh, okay, yeah, no, I think I want to do this today. And if that changes, that you come back to the edge and you just sit out for a while and catch your breath. Yeah. All right. So I want to walk us through a Prezi, in part because there are folks, I think, who really take in information visually as well as auditorily. And so I like to give some visuals as well as the sound of my voice. And so I'm going to walk us through a presentation, and then at the end, as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to offer some time for questions and conversation and dialogue about this material. So, sharing my screen. Sarah, can you just give me a thumbs up because I can see you visually? You can see the screen? Fabulous, thank you. All right, so 1,000 paper cuts, embodied microaggressions in professional practice and everyday life. So here's what we're covering. I want to talk about what are microaggressions, and specifically and particularly, how are microaggressions embodied? Why are they important? Why do we care about them? If they're just micro, what's the big deal? Why are they important? And last, but of course not least, how can we recognize and respond to them? Sometimes in the moment, but sometimes afterwards, because I think responding to microaggressions after the fact can also be really useful. All right, so that's what I'm hoping we'll cover today together. And there are 6 territories that I'm hoping we'll get through and that I want to introduce you to. And before I start, I just want to say in this Prezi, you will see at the edges of each of the slides that I'm going to introduce you to, often some book covers or some faces of people. And this is my way of acknowledging that there's kind of a saying in my community, in the academic community, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so what I mean by that, what's meant by that saying is that we don't do this work alone, and that there have been contributions from many, many places. And the folks I'm going to acknowledge through this presentation today are just a few of the many, many folks who I owe this work to, and that this work is by no means mine alone. It's shared work, and I owe a debt of gratitude to not only the people that I'm going to mention today, but to many, many other folks across many cultures and lands around this work. I want to set the context a little bit, like, why am I so interested in microaggressions? Why do I think that might be useful to us in terms of understanding embodied social justice? And I want to give you a little bit of context by introducing you to 2 quotes. The first one is from Augusto Boal, who is the developer of something called Theater of the Oppressed. And he said something that really resonated for me the first time I heard it. He says, the smallest incidents of our social life, like the everyday stuff, the smallest incidents contain all the moral and political values of society, all its structures of domination and power, all its mechanisms of oppression. And for me, what struck me about that quote when I first encountered it was to realize that we have perhaps been taught that oppression happens at this big macro level of social institutions and laws, and that there are these big oppressive forces that sort of come down on us from above, and that the oppression exists up there in our interactions with these big social structures and institutions. And I think what Bilal is saying, and what I would like to invite us to consider, is that oppression happens here too. It happens at the micro sociological level. It happens between people, and it happens every day, multiple times a day, that we are always sort of navigating, negotiating, power signaling, pushing back, pushing in, and that oppression lives there, not just up here. Yeah, okay. Adrienne Marie Brown also says it really well. And for me, this is the other side of why microaggressions, which is, she, in this quote, I think is beginning to speak to how do we change that? If we are always on our everyday, in our everyday lives, reproducing oppressive social structures at the micro level, then how do we change that? And I think they've got something here when they say what we practice on the small scale sets the pattern for the whole system. So what I'm going to argue here, and hopefully what we're going to begin to engage with and have a dialogue around at the end of this session, is what does that mean for practice? What does that mean for how we go about changing the world? And that, yes, activism and community organizing and macro level social change, like this kind of macro level social change we're seeing in the United States right now, you know, in these last couple of weeks with the change in the federal administration. Those macro level changes absolutely need to happen, but that we can in fact change the world on the small scale as well. And that there is that trickling up, that trickling through, yeah, that networking of change that happens. And I'm going to argue that one of the places where that small scale, where change occurs, is on a body level. Okay. So what are microaggressions? Microaggressions are a term that was originally introduced by Chester Pierce, but really popularized by Derald Wing Sue and his colleagues. There's a picture there on the upper left of Derald Wing Sue, Dr. Sue, who's still a professor of counseling psychology at Columbia University in New York. And Sue's definition of microaggressions is the everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBTQ people, and others who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions. Yeah, so you're starting to see this idea of why I've named this presentation paper cuts, like these little tiny injuries that happen every day. So why are they important? Why do we care? If they're micro, if they're just these little things, why are they important? So here's a couple of thoughts that might be useful. I think microaggressions are important because they're, I think, manifestations of something that's called implicit bias. That is, those beliefs and attitudes and values that we hold about ourselves and other people that we don't realize that we hold. they are sometimes these biases, these distortions of perception about ourselves and others, are sometimes, in fact, counter to what we consciously believe. So, for example, as a white person, I may hold this conscious belief that I'm not racist and that I value Black, Indigenous people of color. And yet my implicit bias that I absorbed by being raised in a racist environment, a racist society, shapes unconscious patterns that then can manifest through these microaggressions. Okay, so that leads us to the next point. I think the other piece that's important to consider, whether we're the perpetrator of a microaggression or the victim of a microaggression, that enactment is often unconscious, that I don't mean to be classist, racist, ableist, whatever it is. That's not my intention, but that I have enacted something that reflects an implicit bias that I absorbed through my environment, and I haven't done the work to make it conscious and to shift it. Okay. Microaggressions are also often disguised as something benign, and they are commonly minimized. What's the big deal, right? But they can be deeply impactful. And so here's the paper cut metaphor again. Think about a time where you actually literally got a paper cut. And if you're like me, it might actually have taken a while before you realized you even had it. It was just like, oh, ouch. Oh, that stings. Oh, wow. So sometimes we can have someone engage in a microaggression against us, and we kind of even don't even realize it until later, until we walk away and realize that we were having an okay day before then, but now we feel pretty shitty. Yeah, like a paper cut. Sometimes you don't realize until you wash your hands. Oh, that was oh, ow, now that's stinging. What was that? The other thing about paper cuts, if you've had them, is that they often hurt far more than they look like they do. And so, it's like, ow, look, this paper cut, it really, really stings. And the person that you're showing it to is going, what? I don't see anything. I mean, come on, it's not bleeding. The last thing about paper cuts and the metaphor and the sort of the parallels that I've found between microaggressions and paper cuts is that they can take an incredibly long time to heal. Paper cuts, even though you can't see them and there's often no blood, it takes a long time for them to stop stinging. And so if you imagine that this is something that happens to you every day, and for those of us in the room who are members of marginalized, oppressed social groups, it does happen every day, that the cumulative effect of all of those paper cuts can be really deeply impactful. Yeah, okay. So I want to take that whole piece around microaggressions and I want to put it in the realm of the body and talk a little bit about what are embodied microaggressions, because some of these slights and insults and put downs that you might be thinking of in terms of microaggressions that you've experienced or that you might have unwittingly, in fact, enacted, you might be thinking of them as sort of verbal insults or name calling or saying something insensitive. And although that is true, microaggressions do happen there. I'm particularly interested in the microaggressions that get enacted on a body level. So what I mean by that is microaggressions that happen through the use of space, touch, eye contact, posture, gesture, and facial expression. Part of the reason that I'm interested in embodied microaggressions is, of course, I'm a body person. I'm interested in all things body. But I think they're particularly important in any taking up of the issue of microaggressions, because I'm going to suggest that they're in fact more difficult to recognize than the verbal ones. I'm also going to suggest that they may be more unconscious, because most of us aren't really aware of what we're doing with our bodies. We might have learned not to say stupid shit, right? But we're not paying attention sometimes to the stupid shit that's coming out through our body language, because, like I said, most of us don't. We're not trained to pay attention to that. The last piece that I think is important around embodied microaggressions is that because the terrain of nonverbal interaction is more open to interpretation, these microaggressions can come with what I call built-in deniability, right? That someone engages with you non-verbally in a way that feels disrespectful or marginalizing or invasive, and you call them on it and they go, what? No, that's not, I don't, what? You know, for me, the classic is like, no, that's just my face. No, you know, that's you're misinterpreting what I'm doing. Okay. And of course, that's incredibly invalidating, frustrating, and sometimes crazy making, right? When we experience an embodied microaggression and the person who's enacted that microaggression insists that that's not what's happening, okay? And I think, you know, it's perhaps easier to say, no, actually you did say that, you did say those words, those insulting put down words, but it's harder to insist, I think, that there was an injury that happened as a result of someone's nonverbal behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to mention, for those of you who want to read up more on this, Christine Caldwell, Lucia Layton, and I co-authored an article called Embodied Microaggressions in Clinical Practice. I think that's what we called it. It's in the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development. And if you go to my website, I know that that it's posted on this in this Zoom chat. You can follow the links to readings, and you can get a copy of this article if you want. So I just wanted to mention that for those of you who want to do some additional reading. All right. So why do we care? I've spoken to this a little bit already, but I want to say a little more. And this takes us into the territory of nonverbal communication, which really, in terms of the scholarship, the research on nonverbal communication really had its heyday, at least in Europe and North America, in the 70s and 80s. So some of this research is a little bit dated, but even more current research seems to support a couple of really key ideas that I want to introduce you to. The first one is we might be focused on what we say verbally to one another in our interactions with other people, but in fact, the research in nonverbal communication really clearly suggests that most of the meaning of our interpersonal communication isn't conveyed through the words that we say. It's actually conveyed nonverbally through what our bodies are saying, including our tone of voice, but also even completely aside from what's happening vocally, what's happening in the rest of us. And as I indicated before, most of us have been taught not to pay very much attention to what we're doing with our own bodies, even though I'm going to argue many of us have gotten really good at paying attention to other people's body language, right? In my earlier dedication on this session, dedicated to everyone who has ever scanned their environment for relational threat, I'm going to suggest that part of what you were scanning for was people's body language, right? That's part of what we learn how to pay attention to when we are a member of a socially subordinated and vulnerable group, and when we find ourselves in a context where that identity is salient and where we can expect the possibility of some threat or some intimidation, that we learn how to pay attention to other people's body language. The other reason why I think embodied microaggressions are so important is the other thing that the research indicates is that when the verbal message, what I'm saying with my words, is contradicted by what I'm saying with my body or what you're reading on my body, it's the nonverbal message that we believe. Faced with a contradiction between those two things, it's the nonverbal that we believe. So let me just give you an example. I'm going to push my chair back so that hopefully you can see me a little bit. I'm actually going to stop sharing so that you can really see this. Yeah. No, I'm fine. Well, do you believe that I'm fine? Of course you don't believe that I'm fine, because my body language was saying that I wasn't fine. Okay, so that's just one small example, and I'm sure you can think of many in your own lives. When someone told you something and you didn't believe them because what you were reading on their bodies through their body language contradicted what they said they meant. And here's another complication that's really important, I think, to recognize, is that our nonverbal communication is really culturally varied and contextually dependent. So when I said, when you read the message on someone's body that contradicted what they were saying with their words, I think it's really important to recognize that there was a process of interpretation there. It's not what they were saying with their bodies necessarily. What's, I think, more accurate is to think of it as what I read. And that I'm going to be reading body language based on the filters and interpretive frameworks that I grew up with, or that I was taught through my membership in particular cultural and social groups, so that I will have learned, I will have picked up just by modeling the people around me, how to signal things, how to say things through my nonverbal communication. But I'm also going to interpret what other people are saying with their bodies through those same interpretive frameworks. And that those interpretive frameworks aren't necessarily the same across cultures and across different social groups. Part of the reason that I think that that's important is that our interpretation of someone's body language may not be at all what they meant, because they were speaking using the language that they learned, and it's not the same as the language you learned. Okay, so there's lots of room here for cross-cultural misunderstanding and misinterpretation. Okay, so I just think it's so important to keep in mind. And one of the ways that I've found useful to hold that is to be curious rather than convinced of the meaning of someone else's body language. I may get an immediate sort of visceral hit as I'm taking in someone else's body language, but I try to pause. I try to go, okay, that's what I heard based on the frameworks and the lenses that I have. But maybe it's not what they meant. And if we can add to that, maybe it in fact is what they meant, but they didn't realize they were saying it because they were expressing something based on their implicit bias and they had no idea that that's what their body was saying. Okay, so I think it's helpful to have a little bit of curiosity and to, as much as we can, consider the context and consider the cross-cultural variations here. All right, last piece on this whole territory of embodied microaggressions, and then I want to take us into some details and hopefully offer you some opportunities to try this on a little bit, imagining it in and through your own bodies. I'm going to argue, and this is not only my argument. I read it elsewhere, and I believed it, and so I'm going to share it with you. I think our nonverbal social interactions with one another on an everyday level are one of the most common means of social control. That's a big statement. And you can chew on that and push back on it. I encourage you to. But if you think about your everyday life and the ways in which other people support you, affirm you, validate you, encourage you, or dismiss you, ignore you, disrespect you, invade you, treat you as if you're not important. If you think of all of how that happens on an everyday level and the cumulative effects of that, I'm going to suggest that how we learn about our own value as human beings in these relational, social, interpersonal contexts, that a lot of that gets conveyed on this microsociological nonverbal territory. Okay. So I'm going to pause for water. I invite you to do the same if you want to take a step back and just kind of, because that was a lot of stuff. If you're someone who likes to write, you maybe have been writing all along, but there might be some things that you want to jot down, some questions that you have about this material that you might want to ask when we get to that point in the session. All right. So I want to unpack this whole thing of nonverbal communication a little bit, and specifically I want to offer some concrete examples of embodied microaggressions across these different territories that I mentioned earlier. And the first one that I want to invite us to look at is how these embodied microaggressions can occur using the medium of interpersonal navigation of space. So by space, I mean the space around us and the space between us and other people. And as I'm naming these things, I just invite you to consider, have I had this happen before? Do I recognize this? Have I maybe done it? Because I think that's the other piece that's useful here, is to consider the possibility that we may be experiencing microaggressions and enacting them. So to the extent that that's useful to you, I just invite you to look at both sides as we're going through. So one example of an embodied microaggression that occurs through the use of interpersonal space is failing to share space. There is a classic study in the nonverbal communication literature where they observed in an office corridor, a narrow office corridor, men and women, I'm going to put my hands this way so that you can see it, men and women passing one another, coming from opposite directions, but passing one another in a narrow space where there wasn't really room for both people to fit. And what they found pretty consistently is that the women would cede the space and that the men would just barrel through. And that the women had learned that they needed to make space for the men who were just going to walk in a straight line because it was basically their hallway, right? So failing to share space, expecting to give others to give up space, and invading space. So coming in, and this is a place where cross-cultural variations are really important to keep in mind, but coming in too close or having someone come in too close to you. Yeah. So you just think about if you've ever had that happen, someone who has, in fact, indicated their power, signaled their power by getting in your face. Yeah, okay. So I want to tell you a little story about what was shared with me by one of my research participants. And she described something that hopefully some of you will recognize in your own life. I just wanted to give you an illustration. So this is a pseudonym, but this is an experience from Chrissy, who was mixed race Aboriginal white woman who experienced in her life a real set of cultural shifts as she moved from the small town in Ontario in Canada to a big city. And so I just want to read a small excerpt from her narrative to give you an example of microaggressions and the use of space. Chrissy talks about experiences in which men invaded her personal space under the guise of necessity, and where men situated themselves or moved against her in ways that were unnecessarily intimate. She cites an example on a crowded subway car in which a man pressed his pelvis into her buttocks, and another in a supermarket where a male shopper made full body contact as he pushed past her in line. For Chrissy, it was clear that neither of those men needed to be so close, but that they had used the situation to enact a covert form of sexual assault that could probably never be proven as such. Okay, so maybe just take a moment and settle and ground and take a breath if you need to. And hopefully that description helped to offer some clarification of what I mean by, or some of the things that I mean by microaggressions in use of space. All right. I think we've got some time to do this. So for those of you who would like, I want to invite us all to take a moment and also do a little bit of a practice around some claiming of space, sort of particularly if you've lived your life in a way where you've experienced a lot of misuse of interpersonal space in ways that were disrespectful or were microaggressions. It can be sometimes useful just to take a moment and to claim some space. So just in your own spot, you can do this from sitting where you are, if that's comfortable. For those of you who might like to stand up and really kind of get into this, you're welcome to do that, just whatever feels right. And I'd like to just give you a moment first to ground where you are. And by that just means putting your feet close to the ground, connecting with the earth. Just so that you're stable. Just right, there's the earth. It's always there. Same earth that has been there since before your first waking moment as a human being, always there, our whole lives. Just take a moment, go, yeah, right. Grounding into the earth. And you can do that from sitting as well. Just noticing that stable presence underneath you that's always there. And then perhaps just taking a moment to reach up as far as feels comfortable and noticing the space around you. Yeah, so you've got this solid, stable presence underneath you. But also there's this space around you that hopefully you've got a little bit of room where you are to move in, that I think you could actually, if you wanted to, consider yours. Yeah, this is my space. All of the space above me as far as I can comfortably reach. Now, of course, only reaching as far as feels right for you and your body. And as you reach above and behind and side to side and maybe down around you, closer to the ground, allow your awareness to fill that space as well. But it's not just you moving in that space, it's like, claiming space. And as you do that, maybe also just noticing where in that space feels comfortable to claim, and where in that space maybe feels a little, maybe a little edgy. Maybe it's territory that doesn't feel quite comfortable or not quite yours. Yeah, just noticing without judgment. But then allowing yourself to finish up just by acknowledging the space around you that does feel comfortable, that does feel like, yeah, this is mine. This is where I like to hang out. Doesn't have to be all the space. Just where do I feel at home? Where in this space around me feels like mine? And take a moment just to really claim that. Staying connected to the earth underneath you. And to your breath, if that feels comfortable. Maybe to your heart or your belly. And maybe just finish with that visceral sense, that embodied, felt sense of my space. Yeah. All right. So if you've been standing, just invite you to come back to your computer, come back to the screen. And hopefully for some of you that will have served perhaps as a little bit of a corrective or a little bit of an invitation that even when we live our lives feeling as though others don't respect our space, we can still respect our space, right? We can do that for ourselves. All right. The literature in nonverbal communication says that there are some other ways in which microaggressions can occur through posture. By that I mean sort of where our bodies are in terms of our uprightness or our collapsedness or our expansion. Our gestures, which is the different things that we do, hands, gestures, other kinds of movements in our body that communicate something. And of course, our facial expressions. Even just saying those words, and if you were imagining all the things that happen through posture, gesture, and facial expression, and how much attention we've learned to pay to those things in other people, you can just get a sense that this is a huge territory. And we're not gonna be able to cover all of it and give you all of the examples. But here are just a few, just to kind of get you warmed up to the idea of what I mean here by microaggressions through posture, gesture, and facial expression. One of the ways in which microaggressions can be conveyed through posture is by commanding posture. And I don't know if you can see me on my little tiny screen, but I've got my hands on my hips and my chest is out and my elbows are out. I am actually, interestingly, taking up a lot of space, but I'm also saying, I'm the boss here. I'm commanding. And if you've ever been in an argument with someone, particularly if you've ever been in an argument with someone who holds more power than you do, just imagine how you would feel if they took up this posture. If you were me, you might go, okay, I think I just lost. I think that's just now the end of the argument, and I'm being told in no uncertain terms, I'm the boss, and you need to stop now. You need to stop arguing with me, right? We might also recognize it as a parent posture that's not intended to be, abusive or microaggressive, but it really does, it can be used in that way, yeah? Conversely, there can also be a very closed posture, a shut off or a shut away, turned away posture that can convey to us, oh, someone's literally not taking me in. I'm here, but they are not letting me in. They are not including me. They're not wanting to acknowledge my presence. And the way that they're conveying that is by closing off their posture. Hopefully that makes sense. One of the other nonverbal indicators of power that can be sometimes used as power over is the use of very direct, forceful gestures. You've ever had anybody sort of point their finger at you and get right up in your space and point? That can be really feel invasive and microaggressive. The last example I want to share with you is something that's a little bit of an interesting twist. And this is something that Shulamith Firestone, who was a feminist activist way back in the day, called the smile imperative. And she was talking about it specifically around gender relations, male-female gender relations, and the use of power to engage in these particular microaggressions using facial expression. And what she meant by the smile imperative is this behavior on the part of men where total strangers would tell women they don't know to smile. Right? If you've ever had that, female identified, had a male identified person come up to you, random stranger on the street, and say, come on, sweetie, smile, it's not that bad. And how awful that feels, and how confusing or perplexing it can be, how awful that feels. Except that when you unpack the smile imperative, what becomes available for questioning, for interrogation, is this whole idea that the smile is considered an expression of submission and appeasement. And so if you unpack this, overtly benign encouragement to smile and have a nice day, what you see underneath is this: I expect you as a woman to appease me by giving me the nonverbal signal of appeasement, which is a smile. Okay, so we can work that way as well. And I think many of the embodied microaggressions that we can experience and unfortunately sometimes enact are demands for nonverbal indicators of appeasement. Right? That the members of the socially subordinated social groups are expected to embody appeasing behavior, and when they don't, they're called on it. And that's what Firestone meant by the smile imperative. You might think about that in your own life and in your own body. If there ever has been a time where failing to smile felt like that was something that perhaps you had an impulse to do, but was too scary, right? If it's too scary to not smile or to stop smiling, consider the possibility that you're smiling as an indicator of appeasement because somebody else with more power expects it. Okay. Of course, smiles can also be for pleasure. I don't want to suggest that they're not, but they are also used in this really covert way that I think can be incredibly destructive and demeaning and demoralizing when it happens on this sort of day-to-day, everyday level. By people who, otherwise perhaps we like or want to like, or want them to like us. So it can be hard. Also happens through eye contact. If you've ever had anyone refuse to look at you, right? You know that this is a way to signal disapproval or lack of recognition, lack of belonging. Microaggressions through eye contact also happen in the opposite way, which is demanding eye contact. Look at me. Why aren't you looking at me? Right? And staring. So it depends on the context, depends on what's happening and who's in the room, but sometimes the person who's the member of the dominant social group in that situation will either not look at you or not stop looking at you. And it all feels bad. And, I think just it's important to recognize how much power dynamics get communicated through these little tiny things. Last but not least, unwanted or uninvited touch can be a microaggression, an embodied microaggression. Touching to assert dominance. You may have had someone reach out and touch you on the arm or touch you on the shoulder. And in that touch, the message that you got was, settle down, stop arguing, keep your place, right? All of those, you're recognizing, hopefully, some of you, as I'm naming those, recognizing those examples where overtly it's relatively benign because they didn't touch you in a private place, right? They just touched your forearm, or they reached out and touched your hand, or they were talking to you in a professional setting and they reached out and touched your shoulder as a way to say goodbye, but it didn't feel right. Right? And so in those moments where it doesn't feel right, it's I think it's important to consider the possibility that that was a nonverbal power move, and that the reason that it doesn't feel comforting or reassuring or bonding is because, in fact, it was touch used to assert dominance. And related to that is touching to placate. Can look very similar, but basically the message of that touch is to signal, calm down, settle down. Yeah. Okay. So maybe again, just taking a moment, and for this last piece, I might just offer, you can just do this where you're sitting. Particularly if you've experienced a lot of microaggressions through touch in your life, just taking a moment and giving yourself some touch. Touch that feels nourishing and supportive. Using touch to give yourself the message, I have the right to have touch that feels good. Yeah. And that it's not okay when touch from others makes me feel bad or wrong or uncomfortable, even when they didn't intend it. It's still not okay. All right. One more piece, and we're kind of coming into the home stretch in terms of all of the things that I wanted to offer to bring into the conversation around why I think embodied microaggressions are such a big deal. And so this last piece is really, it's really the trauma piece, which is to recognize that systems of oppression are enacted through these microaggressions, and that like the metaphor of the paper cut and the idea of death by 1,000 paper cuts, the cumulative effect of a lifetime of microaggressions can be traumatic. And I think that's maybe a little different from how we're used to understanding trauma, which are these big, overwhelming events in our lives. But part of what the research on embodied microaggressions and trauma and oppression is showing us is that people with no known history of major traumatic events, but a lifetime history of oppression, can actually score higher on PTSD scales than people who do have known big traumas in their life. So I'm not overstating when I say embodied microaggressions, the cumulative effect can be traumatic. And part of the reason I want to bring this in is that we need to recognize what happens to us if we have a history of experiencing microaggressions because of that cumulative effect. It's important to not think that we're overreacting, right? That we're experiencing this cumulative effect. We're beginning to show some of the indicators of complex trauma, including vigilance. I talked about this earlier, scanning the environment for possible embodied relational threat. Somatic dissociation, which is actually fleeing and not being connected to our own bodies because they're so often the site of aggression. Intrusive body memories, which really basically just means remembering the visceral feelings of a past event without necessarily having the video to go with the memory. You just feel how it felt in your body. Movement constriction. I stopped moving very much because moving makes me a target, right? So my movement patterns and postures get really small and really contained. I'm trying to not be a target for these embodied microaggressions, and body shame. Yeah. So I just want to name Pat Ogden's Trauma and the Body, Peter Levine's In an Unspoken Voice, and of course, Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands as really good supplementary sources for looking at how is oppression traumatic. And so that when someone, and again, perhaps entirely inadvertently, enacts a microaggression on us, and all of a sudden we're experiencing the full bodily response of huge threat. Our hearts are pounding and we can't catch our breath, and our throat goes dry and we don't feel like we can speak, and we think, oh my God, why am I so freaked out by this little thing? This trauma piece hopefully helps us understand why our responses can be so big to an event that on the surface may look so little. It's because of this history and this cumulative effect of microaggressions and our embodied automatic response to trauma. Yeah, and to give ourselves a little bit of breathing space and a little bit of grace, rather than giving ourselves a hard time or imagining that we're somehow overreacting. Not overreacting, just reacting, right? And that the reaction actually makes sense given this understanding that we have of oppression as traumatic. So just pulling it all together, how we speak to one another through our body language enacts and maintains inequitable, unfair, unjust social power dynamics. These embodied microaggressions, they might be unintentional, but they can really hurt, like these silent relational paper cuts. And that embodied microaggressions can elicit a trauma response, and the cumulative effects can build over time. So what does that mean? What do we do with that? What I'm going to suggest is that, and this is sort of maybe a big term, embodied reflexivity, but what I'm really meaning by that is taking the time to get to know ourselves in our own bodies. Yeah, just, what's here for me, and maybe taking the time to understand myself and my own history and my own history of responses around these issues, that can be a really important first step. And that this process of doing this work, even if you do your own reflections mostly on your own, it can really help to have people around you who are engaged with you and embodied in themselves, whether that's a therapist or a trusted friend or community members who are really kind of like, yeah, we get this too, and we'll talk with you about it, and we will support you as you practice resistance to microaggressions, or hear you when you talk about them, and as you kind of reflect on what this has been like for you. And so here are some questions that you might, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you take them up now, but you might want to take them away and give them some mulling over, with some kindness and some generosity of spirit, really being kind to yourself as you do this. But you might ask yourself, where do your own injuries and scar tissue live in your body? Where might they be present in your nervous system and perhaps in your own nonverbal patterns? And on the other side, how might unconscious patterns of privilege and bias, the ones that we inherited, the ones that we've taken on and taken in without realizing it, how might those patterns express themselves in our own body language? Yeah. So to take that out into the world, you might want to begin to notice how you interact non-verbally with other people. How do you use space, touch, posture, and gestures to signal power or to signal appeasement or submission? And I would invite all of us, and this is sometimes hard to do, take seriously the embodied microaggressions that you might have enacted that others point out to you, how important that is, just to validate when that happens. And I would argue we all do it. There are all places where we've been taught and trained to consider some people different and less than, and that those differences and those unexamined biases manifest through that channel of our body language. I want to give you 3 sort of sets of tips. I'm not going to take a lot of time with them, but I will share this Prezi on the Facebook page so that you can come back to it and look at it in more detail, so you can sort of take it away as a handout. But I do want to go through them now and then give some time for some questions and answers. Again, this is not my own work alone. I've pulled together from lots of folks with good ideas about tips for responding, in this case, verbally to an embodied microaggression. My first recommendation is, even if it's just taking a quick moment to catch your breath, or maybe it's, I'm going to go away and I'm going to talk to a friend and I'm going to come up with a plan and then I'm going to come back. But whatever you need to do to get resourced first. Yeah, just to recognize how upsetting, disorienting, destabilizing embodied microaggressions can be. I'd invite you to consider the context. Is this something that you want to do in the moment? And sometimes you do. But maybe this is something that you would actually rather take up later. And so just ask yourself perhaps that question. Really would recommend that you choose your battles. If you responded to every embodied microaggression that came your way, that would be exhausting, right? So that you just to let yourself off the hook if you don't, if you don't actually respond to each and every one of them, that's okay. That you get to choose your battles. When you respond verbally to an embodied microaggression that someone else has enacted, I think it's useful to describe the behavior and its impact rather than characterize the person, keeping in mind that that person may in fact have enacted that microaggression without intending it. And so it's useful to just say, I saw this and that I felt this as a result of this behavior. You might want to ask for what you want, because sometimes the person is clueless about what they should do. And it can be whatever feels right, but perhaps an apology, making amends, like doing something to change the impact or correct the impact, and then perhaps change behavior going forward. And after the interaction where you've responded verbally to someone else's embodied microaggression, I would just invite you to think about, get resourced afterwards as well, because it can be hard, it can be challenging and scary and activating. And so to finish by maybe going and talking to somebody, or going somewhere nice, or doing whatever it is that helps you settle and feel nourished and supported. Yeah. You can also respond non-verbally to embodied microaggressions. You don't always have to verbally name it to the person. And the first two steps for this are the same as when you decide to actually intervene verbally, which is get resourced and choose your battles. But you can also engage your body as an instrument of intervention. And I want to read you an excerpt from another excerpt from a narrative from some of my research. And this is from Zaley. Zaley brings a very rich and complex background as a bicultural, biracial, bisexual woman. And she brought a history of dance. And so she got very articulate, she got very good at using her body to communicate. And so I just want to read you this excerpt. Zaley consciously uses her learned capacity to articulate concise nonverbal messages as a way to resist or deflect microaggressions. For instance, when she's feeling marginalized during a hospital staff meeting, she may sit a little taller in her seat and hold her head a certain way to communicate an array of messages: that she belongs there and feels entitled to contribute to the conversation, or that she's unhappy with the way the conversation is going. Sometimes she's communicating that she's strong and intelligent, or that she's prepared to regard others in a critical light. She also uses physical contact to get others to pay attention when she feels that they've been ignoring her. So you can see that even without saying a word, Zaley is able to use her own nonverbal communication to resist and deflect and to intervene, and that those interventions have an impact on the people around her. And what she described to me was that she was actually able to get the people in the room, all of whom who had more power, to actually pay attention to her in a different way and to regard her in a different way, just by the way she was consciously using her own body language to counteract the embodied microaggressions that she was experiencing. I'm going to do one last piece because I want to give us a couple minutes for questions. So someone has said to you that you've enacted an embodied microaggression. Hopefully it was unintentional, and so you might be feeling a little bit flat-footed and a little bit flummoxed. And so I'd like to just invite that you might want to take a moment just to find your feet and to do what you can to get settled and resourced so that you can listen attentively, so that you can actually settle your own nervous system enough to really pay attention to them. I think it's important in these moments to recognize that even though it hopefully was not your intention to be dismissive or hurtful or aggressive, that what's important to pay attention to here is the impact on them, and how important it is, once you've really listened to the impact, that you offer some repair. That might be that you apologize, you make amends, you offer to make amends. You might commit to change behavior going forward. and that in those offers to repair, you offer rather than insist, that you offer what's useful to the other person, or you offer what they've asked for. And that in doing that, and in doing that in a resourced way, hopefully one of the things that you're not doing is overloading the interaction with your own upset, right? That you haven't all of a sudden shifted the conversation to how upset and apologetic and contrite and oh my God you are, but instead kept the focus on the person who's experienced the injury and just be there for them. And of course, that can be really hard to do. I think many of us have a lot of practice. And so I'd offer that getting resourced afterwards, having an opportunity to settle and get nourished or to debrief can be incredibly helpful. And that's us. So I'm going to stop sharing. There we are, back. So we've got about 10 minutes, I think, Sarah, to have some conversation.
Yes, that's great.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So questions through the chat, and I'll let someone else find them. Thank you. The chat's now open. And if there are folks who would just like to unmute and ask a question, I'd be happy to field the questions that you might have.
Wow, Marissa had a really powerful question. I don't if you see that in the chat, Ray.
I don't. Can you read it for me?
It says, what does it mean to claim space as a settler in a settler colonial state?
Yeah. I think it's really important to make the distinction between inhabiting the space around our bodies and claiming territory on land. And that one of the challenges, I think, for those of us who live on unceded territory that has been stolen by force and violence and genocide, is how do we figure out how to share space? And for me, that's really the salient question, is that there may be some space around my body that I want to claim as mine for my own well-being, that I think as a human being to have some room to move and to breathe and to express. But that when I'm in the presence of other people, that I'm listening to and attending to, how do we share that? How do I not impose my need for space on someone else? How do I listen to when they may need more space? And particularly for those of us in situations where we're holding a lot of privilege, I think it can be incredibly helpful to just go, okay, I'm just going to back up a little bit. I'm just going to give the people who don't get enough space in this kind of context, I'm going to make some space. I'm going to sit back and give space to the people who haven't had it and who ought to have had it. And that's my response in terms of how I share. It's not equitable sharing of space is not the same as even sharing of space, if that makes sense. So absolutely. Thank you for that question. It was a fabulous question. Yeah.
Yeah, so many amazing questions and commentaries in the chat, but there's one in particular that I see that I think is a really necessary clarification potentially
sure.
in space. And it comes from Brother Giacomo. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Giacomo?
Giacomo, can embodied microaggressions also happen between two or more individuals within the, I believe, same minority, from the same ethnic group
Mhm.
or same LGBTQ part of the spectrum, both
Yep.
female
Yep.
presenting, etc.? If so, how to approach it in a way that sees the other individual while also setting boundaries? Very important
Yeah.
question.
Really important question. And so I think I'll start just by returning us to the definition of a microaggression, which is as it's been understood, as it's been put forward by Chester Pierce and Daryl Sue and those folks. They really do mean it to describe an enactment of social power against people with less power, people who have been subordinated, oppressed, marginalized. So when we use that term, that's really what it means. We're really talking about an interaction between two people with differing social power, differing privilege in a particular situation. So Giacomo, your question is really about, so what happens when the social power of two people is kind of the same, kind of equivalent? I would argue that it's never exactly that, and that how much power someone has shifts according to the context that they're in, right? Sometimes I have a lot, sometimes I don't have very much at all. And sometimes I might get used to feeling like I don't have very much at all and forget to recognize when I have a lot, right? But in those situations where, Giacomo, maybe your assessment is, we've got about the same amount of power, I would describe it as, I wouldn't use that term microaggression, but I would acknowledge that we do these micro injuries to one another, that we, even when we're sort of kind of hold the same kind of social locations, that we can be disrespectful, we can be invasive and unkind and mean and insulting. Absolutely, that happens. So I would never suggest that that doesn't happen a lot. What I would invite us to do when that's happening, to ask ourselves, what role does social power play in this interaction? And is there an imbalance of social power that I'm not appreciating? Maybe I'm pretending that we're just equals, when in fact the other person may not be experiencing that. They may be experiencing me as having more power because of my social location. So I just think it's an important question to ask. But no, you're absolutely right, Giacomo. For sure, that kind of shit happens just amongst us all, and it's not necessarily a microaggression in the way that I'm describing here.
Thank you so much for your heartfelt answer, Ray. I think that we have time for just one more,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I'd love to bring this particular being's voice from the chat into the room. Kendra says, I'm curious if you have any tips for navigating nonverbal microaggressions in complex, multi-directional power dynamic situations. For example, I am an autistic white trans person, and
Yes.
my nonverbal communication can be misinterpreted, especially in cross neurotype communication. Wow,
Yes.
let's take
Uh-huh.
that in, right? The power differential between
Mm-hmm.
neurotypical, right, and non neurotypical, whatever that means to us. I'm
Yeah.
wondering how I can both effectively hold space for impacts of my nonverbal communication on others where it may do harm, while
Yeah.
also holding space for pain and trauma that may come up within me, having a lack of eye contact, stimming facial expressions, tone of voice,
Mm-hmm.
misunderstood, or read as negative, unacceptable, or rude. So important. So important.
Yes. Thank you, Kendra, for that question. Because part of part of how I'm hearing what you're asking is is hooking back into what I said earlier about the real possibility of significant misunderstandings occurring cross-culturally. Yeah. And so one of the ways that we might expand that understanding of what kinds of cross-cultural differences do we mean here is to recognize neurodiversity as one of those differences where misinterpretation, misunderstanding, miscommunication might be happening. And so, Kendra, your description was spot on. What part of what I heard was that you don't feel particularly well understood by neurotypicals, and that at the same time, when they don't understand your nonverbal behavior, they can misinterpret, they don't understand. Yeah, so that that misinterpretation can go lots of ways. And this is sort of my standard tip. It's not rocket science, but it is what I've found to be helpful, which is to be curious and to ask questions, and to consider the possibility that the misunderstanding is not lack of goodwill. Sometimes it is, but consider the possibility that maybe it isn't, and to get curious about what might be going wrong in this communication. And it sounds, Kendra, like you already have, like you've already got a really good handle on that, but that there might be contexts where if you're with certain people enough, that it's worth having the conversation about the misunderstandings, about the expectations that you might be experiencing that folks who are more neurotypical put on you, and the ways in which they may not be understanding the way you're speaking through your body.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the deep wisdom and questions that are being shared. We won't have time to get to everyone's questions today. However, there is a Facebook community where we can continue the conversation and what is arising for us. Thank you, Dr. Ray Johnson. I've learned so much. There's such richness and complexity in what it is that you're bringing to our awareness. And I feel so confident that as we leave this space today, that we will all carry ourselves with so much more loving and compassionate nuance and awareness of the power that we hold and that we carry to affect change, positive change in our body language. So thank you so very much for this.
Thank you. I second that, Sarah. That's my hope. That's my hope, is that we'll come to appreciate the power for change that we have in our smallest gestures. Mm-hmm. We can change the world through the tiniest movements. Yeah. And that the cumulative effect shifts the dynamics in our world, in our social worlds, in a positive way.
Right. That's a lot of power. That is a lot of combination of power right there. And what an incredible message that when learned helplessness arises in our bodies, we don't have to lean into that in a way that limits our capacity to heal. We are actually truly deeply empowered on the micro level. And again, Dr. Ray and I just want to give so much thanks and gratitude to you all for your presence, for your commitment to this process. Ray, is there any last thing you'd like to say before we shift into a space of pause?
The only thing I think I would add is how lovely it's been to have you as my host, Sarah. I saw your face and your responsiveness to what I was saying, and it was just incredibly anchoring and encouraging. So thank you for that, and thank you to all of you for being with us all today, and thank you to our wonderful tech assistants for keeping us all on track. So I'm looking forward to more. I'll be with you on a panel tomorrow and hosting other sessions. So looking forward to hanging out with you all some more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. See you soon.